Okay, hooligans, let's start. Hello. Hi. Hello again, and we are talking about dissertations today for the second time. This is the last session we have this semester. We will meet again in January. And we need to cover a lot of things today, although I will leave 5-10 minutes at the end where we could have a Q&A session, or you can approach me and ask me more specific questions. What I would like to talk about is first to go through again the various deadlines that you need to keep in mind. And secondly, today I would like to talk about literature reviews. Literature review is a very important part of your dissertation, and it's often quite tricky to write. So this is what we're going to do. Last time we discussed a lot of things. I won't go through them again. I'll mention research questions a little bit. But this is just to remind you all the materials are on Keats, including the slides. You might find them helpful in a few months when you'll be going through the various sections of your dissertations. So remember, there's a lot of information on slides about what kind of research questions work and not, how to go from a topic to a research question, what are the various parts of the dissertation. This is all online available to you. Today, we'll talk about the dissertation timeline, we'll talk about research question, but more contextualizing it with literature review. We'll talk about how your literature review is an argument, like your whole dissertation should be an argument. So how to go about writing one and how to do it effectively will be the task today. First though, again this timeline, but this time we have more precise dates for you to keep in mind, to note and remember. These are your key dissertation dates next year. First and foremost, 5th of February is your first main deadline for this course. 5th of February, 4 p.m. is where you have to submit a dissertation abstract on Keats. We talked about it last time. I'll talk about it a little bit today. It's not a very long thing. It's just a couple of sections. But you need to absolutely do this by 5th of February. Because I will use this data to assign you a dissertation supervisor sometime in February. Then you know that you will be working with your supervisor in April, May, and June. The next big deadline is 15th of May 2019. This is, again, a very strict deadline. You need to submit your ethics approval by that time. That means that ethics is handled by an external process. You need to submit something to school, especially if you're using human participants, right? So you fill out the form, it goes through the ethics committee, they assess what kind of risks are there. This process can be very quick, but can also be not very quick. That's why this deadline is very important. If you miss this deadline, all sorts of complications happen to your dissertation. So I'll cover this in January when we talk about methods and ethics. For now, it's just a deadline to remember. And then finally, your date of submission is 5th of September 2019, 4 p.m. as usual. This is the most important deadline of them all, because if you miss it, then all sorts of bad things happen. You get minus marks if you submit slightly late, or you have to retake the whole course if you are very late. So, the first deadline though, we have some sessions before you need to submit, but this is generally what you need to do. A research question, so 1 or 2 sentences. It needs to actually be a question, right? So not a statement, it needs to actually be a question that you will answer in your dissertation. An abstract of 300 words, up to 300 words. There's no real structure to that, it can be free form, but it should mention why you're doing this dissertation, what is interesting about it, what kind of theories you're thinking of using, what kind of methods you're thinking of approaching, why should it be done, something along those lines. Then example bibliography, up to 10 items, but I would say no fewer than 5 of sources that are relevant to your topic. And these should be either academic sources or industry data, but not news, not commentary, not magazine articles. It should be scholarly sources or data from industry. Keywords, they might be generally helpful. Like if you had 5 to 10 keywords, how would you characterize your research? It could be keywords that have to do with your method, such as interviews, data scraping, right? These are keywords. May have to do with theory, right? So it could be audience theory or determination theory or some kind of theories. Or it could be keywords that pertain to your particular topic, right? So Twitter, data analysis, big data in Scotland, and so on and so on. And then finally, there is a section there that asks you about a potential supervisor. You can list more than 1, but no more than 3 potential supervisors. I would advise to meet with them first and discuss your research between now and February 5th, even if you have very rough idea, just to come to office hours for professors, send them an email, and see whether they'll be interested, whether they have some advice for you. On the Digital Humanities Department website, you have a list of all the staff and their research interests, research that they do, publications that they have written. You will see what kind of topics they potentially can supervise. If you have absolutely no idea because nobody deals with your topic, you can leave this blank. I will assign you a supervisor anyway, and I will try to do a good job out of it. But it will help if you already have a contact with your supervisor, with potential supervisor, and have some primary discussions. As I said, listing a potential supervisor doesn't mean you will get the supervisor because there's a lot of workload involved, complications, but we'll try to have a very good match between your research and the supervisor. So this form is already available on Keats. I will open Keats in a second. You can already start filling it if you feel like it, but definitely submit it by February 5th using the submission facility there. Now, a little bit about the schedule and the things to come next term. Everything is on Keats, as usual. There are 2 types of workshops. There are the compulsory workshops, which you have in your timetable. You don't need to note them because you have them in your timetable. They're mostly with me here. But there also will be optional workshops that will begin in January, which you will have the ability to sign up for. These will deal with a particular method or a particular approach, and they will give you more specific skills how to use that method. So you don't need to attend all of them. In fact, you probably shouldn't, because there's just no way you will use all of the methods in your dissertation. But if you're thinking about you need training in a particular aspect, you can sign up for them. The places will be limited, but there should be enough spaces for everyone. So these will be the timetable, the compulsory seminars. There's something wrong with the numbers, so I need to fix that. But the titles and the dates are right. So we've done the first 2 now. The next one will be 25th of January. We'll talk about the methods, different kinds of methods. So I'll give you an introduction, what kind of methods you can use. Even if you're doing a theoretical or project-based dissertation, you still need to think about research design. So I'll talk about this in January. And then after that, we will have seminars that have to do with specific methods, right? So Pete Chonka in February will talk about interviews and focus groups. Then I'll talk about text analysis, first about qualitative text analysis, discourse analysis, and then about quantitative text analysis and historical methods. And then finally, end of March, we will bring it all together. You should be in a good place by then. You should be ready to write it all up, and this is where we will then take it forward and say how to structure a dissertation, how to submit, what happens after you submit, how to polish your writing and all that. So these are the seminars I will definitely see you at, and these are the optional seminars you will have a chance to sign up for. The sign-up will open in January, and you'll be informed in advance. There's something about study skills, there's something about finding sources, writing an abstract. Now, this doesn't mean this abstract that you need to submit in February. That's the abstract from actual dissertation. There's a skill of writing those things. And then seminars that have to do with methods. So designing an interview study, designing a visual method study, a survey study, visualizing data using R software, working with survey data, so statistics. Yeah, that's it, really. So we'll talk about this in January, but since you will be spending the break thinking about your research questions and topics anyway, you might as well think about the methods. What methods potentially you want to take. Now, you don't have to attend a workshop to use this method. Maybe you can't make this method workshop, maybe there will be not enough spaces. Various things can happen. All the materials, the slides will be posted online, and you will work with your supervisors on that method anyway. So this is just as an extra workshop to give you perhaps a little bit more experience with the chosen method. Let's go on Keats just for a second, just so we're on the same page. This is the Keats page for all of you. It doesn't matter what program you are, everybody has the same Keats page, which I hope you're visiting frequently. All the lectures are here, all the seminar slides are here. Now, the calendar that I discussed just now about all the deadlines is also here. The research seminars also here. And finally, dissertation abstract form is here. Yeah. All right, so abstract, it tells you as details what should be in an abstract, example bibliography, keywords, and identify up to 3 potential supervisors. So not much, but very important, you make this deadline and you submit. Otherwise, I won't be able to give you a supervisor immediately, and it might take more time for you. Any questions so far about all these procedural things? Good, let's move on then to literature review, but before that, research questions. I keep going about research questions. But as you remember, last time we talked about what kind of questions are good questions. We talked about the questions should be interesting, relevant, original, but also manageable, also answerable. You have to actually be able to answer it after 9 months, 10 months that you have left, right? So it has to be quite specific, but perhaps not too specific. It has to be original, but then again, it won't be completely original. You will not find a new theory probably or a new field of study. So there's a trick. There's a trick about writing them. You don't have to have it right by February 5th. You have to write a research question, but it probably won't be your ultimate research question. It will be your draft research question. You will revise it. You might change it. You might have a completely different one by March or April. So don't stress too much about the abstract form, but it should be there. So we talked about research questions. Just to recap very quickly, I'll give you some research question and I'll ask you whether you think they are good or bad and why. Let's look at this research question. How will the new generation of anti-piracy legislation affect the multimedia market? Thoughts? Bad. Okay, who thinks bad, actually? Let's read the room. 1, 2, okay, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, okay, who thinks it's all right? Okay, good. So, okay, who thinks it's a great one? That's how I phrased the question. Okay, go on then. Why? Shout out, why do you think it's not a very good one? It's too wide, yeah, definitely. It's too wide. Multimedia market where? Everywhere in the whole world? New generation of anti-piracy legislation? Which generation? I mean, well, how many generations are there? That's very vague. We don't know what's going on. Okay, what else? Anything else that you don't like about it? I tell you what I don't like about it. It's asking about the future, right? We can't probably answer it unless it means, we all know that it's going to happen next week, right? And we will change this research question by the end of the dissertation. But as is, we can't answer it because it asks about something that will happen in the future. We cannot predict. Well, we can predict, but it's not a research dissertation, right? Because how will we have the data? The data will be made perhaps based on the data we have now and historical trends of how piracy legislation affects multimedia markets up until 2018. Based on that, we can say, well, there are reasons to think these are the ways they will affect it, but it won't be a very strong answer, right? Why is radio not popular anymore? Well, you're laughing. Okay, go on. Go on then. Why don't you like this one? It's a radio. I mean, there's only one kind of radio, right? Yeah. Well, obviously it's too wide, right? It also makes an assumption that it's perhaps not founded, right? Is radio not popular anymore? I mean, there are parts of the world where radio is still the main source of news and the main source of entertainment. So there are areas where it's pretty strong. So it's too wide, and it has some unchecked assumptions. Is internet important in the lives of young people? So again, we could say this is too wide. Who are young people? What does it mean to be important? But also, it's boring. What is the answer to this? Either yes or no. That's it. We cannot really spread. I suppose we could say it depends, but whether we can write 15,000 words on it depends, probably not, right? So again, questions, yes and no questions, not very good. Questions about the future, questions too wide. Questions about degrees, also something that we might be careful about. To what degree has streaming changed our consumption of movies? I think it's a good topic. There's a lot of streaming. How does streaming affect other media practices, right? If you're doing marketing or if you're doing audience studies, good topic. Not a very good question. What does it mean to what degree? How will you measure the degree? So these are, I think, all of them, 4 very good topics that need work in terms of research question, that need specifying, that needs rephrasing. The way we phrase our research question is tremendously important, and it will be important until the very last submission date, because you'll check whether it all makes sense. So what I want to think, until you think I'm obsessed with research question, because I'm sort of am, but I think of research question as this golden thread that weaves its way throughout your project. It's present everywhere. Even though you specify it at the very beginning and you answer it in the end, it doesn't mean it disappears in between those sections. It shapes your literature review, it shapes your theory, it shapes your methods, it shapes your analysis, it shapes your discussion. All these sections, you should always be thinking, does it make sense with relation to my research question? Does my method stem from my research question? Does my theory connect to the research question? Right? It should be there always in your mind, and you should make those connections explicit. Right, okay. So, moving on to literature review. You remember this slide from last time. I gave an example about how we can have a topic that is fun, but much too wide. How can we narrow it down by sub-questions, by research question, and choose a methodology, right? You remember that. I gave a number of examples. One of them was the idea of digital voice synthesizers. So we said, this is all right, but this is way too wide. Perhaps if we talk about who uses voice synthesizers, right? Let's say, okay, again, too wide. Perhaps we should focus on not all musicians, not all audiences, but amateur musicians, indie, independent musicians. But still too wide. What exactly are we interested in? We're interested in how they deal with authenticity, how they deal with being sort of real for the audiences. So that's a manageable research question. Because it asks about attitudes and emotions, then probably we should ask the people concerned. That's why we chose interview as a method. Fine, so we're here. Now, the question we'll deal with today is how we then look for literature that relates to this research question. What kind of literature we should be reviewing and how to go about doing so. Same with this example. I won't go through specific because we get to that later. But again, we have a specific research question that stems from a wide topic. We have a method. How do we review the literature that is connected to this research question? So we have to start again with a definition. What is a dissertation? I gave you a long definition last time. This time it's a quick. It's a long essay. That's all it is. Your dissertation is a long essay. What is an essay? Essay is an original, because you will write it. Academic, because you will refer to sources. Argument, aimed at persuading your audience of your answer to a research question. So it helps, I think, if you think about your dissertation as a whole, as an argument, as something you are persuading somebody else. You're saying, this is what I found out, this is my answer. And the rest of it, those 15,000 words, are you persuading the reader why your answer is valid. So your dissertation is a one big argument built of many smaller arguments. What is an argument then? Argument begins with a premise or a claim. Right? We say, well, this is how it is. This is this is how the world works. This is how something causes something. This is how something relates to something. Then we use facts and evidence to substantiate it, right? To give evidence, to give support to this claim. That's not all, though. To be an argument, it needs to develop in a logical way. Right? So it has to make sense. A step leads to another step, leads to another step, leads to conclusion. And then finally, it uses references and credits ideas that it's built upon. Right? So again, quite straightforward, but maybe helpful. What we usually think about arguments in a dissertation is about our findings. Right? We find out that this happened, this is our argument. But that's not the only place we find our arguments. In fact, we should think about all sorts of arguments in our dissertation, starting with the theory. Right? Why do we choose a theory? How does a certain theory help us understand our question and answer it? Why we draw from this scholar and not from other scholar? That's already an argument, because we're saying, I chose this theory to explain this phenomenon because I think it's important and it has to do, and in previous research it was proven to something, something, something. Right? It's already an argument, right? Because we're choosing something for a reason. Same with your literature review. It's also an argument. Because we're choosing literature, we're comparing it, we're evaluating it. We're making all sorts of claims about that literature. We're saying, this literature was valuable, this was not so much, and there's a gap. There's no literature at all. These are claims. These are not factual statements. These are our arguments. Methods. Your research design is also an argument. We're saying, I chose this method because this method has been proven in the past to answer similar questions, or because it is equipped with certain methodological tools that give insight to understanding this phenomenon. Right? Again, this is an argument. And finally, what we usually think about arguments, our data, right? What does our analysis show? So that's our, perhaps we can call it the main claim, right? So I found out that this happens. I found out that these two issues are related. I think that the consequence of my findings is development of this branch of industry, right? These are all arguments. So an argument will start with a context. And again, this is a bit dry, but perhaps it will be helpful when you think about how to structure your paragraphs in a dissertation. So each argument will start with an introduction, narration, and say, well, this is the situation, this is the context, this is the phenomenon. Then we will lay the claim, the argument. This is what I think happens. Then we will confirm it with evidence, say, well, I think that because of this data, because of this finding, because of this previous literature. We might, at this stage or somewhere else, consider other viewpoints. So we say, well, I think so, but there are also other views on this topic. And we might refute them altogether. We might concede a bit. Or we might say, well, actually, maybe they're right. And then we bring them all together, and we say, well, bearing all this in mind, this is the argument, and this is the consequence of this argument, which brings us to the next paragraph, to the next section of your dissertation. So why am I talking about these arguments? Because I'm setting up this. Your literature review should always be an argument. Your literature review, one of the crucial things to remember, your literature review should be set up as an argument that justifies your research project. For a reader who takes a look at your literature review, it should be clear, yes, based on this literature review, it's clear why this person is researching this topic. Right? Because there's this gap, this research isn't convincing, this research is strong, nobody combined the two. So literature review as argument is our topic today. Now, what is a literature review, though, first, before we get there? So according to Royal Literary Fund website, literature review is a critical analysis of articles, texts, data, literature that have been written in a chosen topic area. It should show the limitations, it should formulate ideas for further research, and it should spell out any controversies if they are. So the first element of this definition is a critical analysis. It's not just analysis, it's not just a review, it's a critical analysis. What does that mean? It means that it serves two purposes. First, this is according to Annette Markham, I'll give you a link in a second. Yes, it is a systematic search of scholarly work surrounding and specifically related to a research or project. That makes sense, right? We have a project, and we go in depth researching it. What has been written about the topic? Yes, that's fine. But it also is an argument or set of arguments made after reading previous research and theoretical discussions in the area of interest. So it not only reads them and reviews them, but it evaluates it. And historically, students are very good in the first one, in reviewing, looking for a lot of sources, but not always as good in the second one, in evaluating it critically, in deciding which evidence is convincing or not based on other research, in setting up debates, in comparing them. Right? This is more difficult. This is a skill that needs to be built. So, in other words, literature review is both searching through works, searching through literature, and the outcome of the search, so our evaluation of it. It is not just a paper that simply overviews, summarizes, or describes previous studies. It's a part of it, sure, but perhaps not the most important part. Why should we write one in the first place? I'll give three main reasons, which I think it's helpful to keep in mind as you write, to give your writing a direction. First of all, you know all that. We identify gaps in current knowledge. That's why we review. We review what is there, and we look for stuff that it's not there. Right? We have a topic in mind. We have a research question in mind. We sort of hope that it's not there, right? Sometimes, because we have original research in our mind, and we look at the research and say, I hope nobody has written about it yet. And of course they did in most cases, and then we need to find the more specific angle. So one, to identify gaps in current knowledge, right? It helps us put our writing in perspective because it gives us links to other projects. Identify already a critique, right? So the part of the argument was the refutation, right? Considering opposing views, right? This is already helpful because we know the debates. If we choose an angle, we know who critiqued this angle already, right? So we know our enemies, we know the counter-argument. It becomes easier to write later. And finally, to frame the research question. Right? We will frame our research question around that gap that we identify. So one, identify gaps. Two, as part of your evaluation, you want to show off. You want to demonstrate your research skills. This is also what you do through writing an effective literature review. So you show that you're building on existing knowledge. You demonstrate the depth of your knowledge about your topic, specific topic that you are an expert of by September, because nobody looked in depth in this topic as much as you did in your very specific area. It shows that you know how to look for literature in this area, but also you know how to critically evaluate it. So you identify gaps, you demonstrate skills, and finally you inform your next steps. Based on your literature review, you will identify your methods, because you will know the gap, you will know the research question, and therefore you will see what needs to be done and how. And you will finally see, perhaps, through the gap that you identify, which angle now you need to take in order to make your study relevant, interesting, original. So I recommend this if you haven't read this short article by Annette Markham. I'll put it on Keats, obviously. But this is a very friendly written guide for students and researchers writing literature reviews and setting them as arguments. It's a list of bullet points of what a literature review is, how to start on one, practical tips, what should you achieve by one. So I highly recommend it if you want to have a very neat guide of writing literature reviews. The key part that we mentioned, right, it's not just a review, but it's a critical review. What does it mean, right? You don't only report on what you find, you need to evaluate. But what does it mean to evaluate? It doesn't just mean saying whether you like or you didn't like an article or a theory. It's part of it, but you need to provide evidence for all your claims. So instead, you might ask yourself, how does an article fit with other research in the area? Right? Have you identified major findings of this author? Right? Is it an expert on their field? Are there other experts? Do they like each other? Not personally, but if they put it in the room and they discuss the research, right? Is there attention? Are there different strands, or are they from very different disciplines? And those two disciplines don't talk to each other, right? What is the theory, the purpose, and the practical perspective? Right? So one of these skills in reading critically and reviewing critically is looking for stuff that is not there. Right? So, for example, is the author internally consistent? Right? What does it mean? Is there enough evidence, in other words, it's part of it, for him or her to say what they're saying? Right? And they will not tell you that in the article, right, obviously, right? Because they wrote an article and it says, well, this is my finding, young people use social media because 1, 2, 3, right? Okay, fine. Where's the evidence? Right? You need to look through the evidence. Does it make sense? Is there enough data for them to reach this conclusion? Right? Are the sources of this evidence appropriate? Right? Is the sample size okay? Do they fit? Right? Again, the author will not tell you that. You might find it through other research for people that disagree with this person. Right? You say, well, he said that, but his methodology was flawed, or he didn't have enough data, or his premise was wrong. Right? So the more you read, you'll start to see those beefs. You'll start to see how people discuss the research. What are the main debates in the field? Do the conclusions follow from evidence or findings? Right? So perhaps you'll see, okay, there's a lot of data. The data is fine. The research question is fine. But do they warrant their findings, actually? Maybe he goes a step too far. Maybe they're not completely related. Right? So part of it, yes, is deciding whether you like or not the article, because that's how we read. That's the gut feeling. But then you have to decide, well, why don't I like it, actually? Let's look at all the elements of this article. Is it just because it doesn't fit your vision of what the field is, or maybe there are some critical flaws? Okay. So how to write one, then? I think the start, as you know, because we covered last time, is to read a lot and read widely at this stage. I know I told you to narrow down, and I stand by it. Your literature review will be quite narrow, but you cannot start from narrow. Right? Reading widely, reading a lot about this phenomenon from a variety of angles lets you understand what is important, what is not, what is relevant, what are the different perspectives. And even if you then decide, well, I will only use this perspective, you have to be aware of other perspectives, because at some point you will have to say, well, I'm doing that and I'm not doing the other way. And you have to say, why? You say, well, because this is more relevant, because this is more interesting, because this has been done. So last time we talked about taking notes, mapping connections, noticing debates. Not just a summary of relevant articles and books. Definitely not quoting everything that is available on the subject. You will not be evaluated on the number of the quotes. You will not be evaluated on number of items in your bibliography. You will be evaluated of how your literature review demonstrates your research skill and your critical writing. What can you do then? A short checklist. Some of the things we covered already, but much of it has to do with identifying the debates, identify central issues, identifying what has been done and needs to be done further. Now, I've been asked this between our last session and today by a number of students. Everything has been done already. How can I find a research question that is original and relevant? That's true. Most of the things have been done, generally. Even if you wanted to do something completely original, you have to, look at a new technology being developed this week, start on it, and hope nothing gets published by September. But that's not what you should be doing, right? You don't need to find a new field of research. You don't need to find a new technology. You don't need to find an original theory in order to identify the gap. The gap will be smaller. The gap will be something not as groundbreaking. So for example, another question you ask yourself while you're reading literature. Does existing research answer my specific question about the topic? So yes, there's research about this technology, there's research about this practice, but this specific question that I have about this, it hasn't been actually answered. Is there research that attempts to apply this approach to this phenomenon? So something is happening, it has been covered, and then there is an existing theory that has been applied to other things. But nobody took this theory and applied it here. That's a gap. Even though this has been written already, we're not, you're not doing anything new per se, but nobody applied this theoretical framework to this example, to this case study. Right? That's new. Of course, then the next question is, well, should we? Is there benefit in doing so? We cannot just be doing it, well, just because nobody did, because maybe it shouldn't be done, because no new knowledge will be found. But as long as we have a rationale, and we think there is something new to be learned, sure, that's a gap. I think I discussed this very briefly last time, but this is also a gap. So is there research in this field done in my specific context? Right? So there might be research done on young people's use of social media, but perhaps not in country X, perhaps not on this particular platform, which is interesting for some reason. Perhaps, yes, teenagers, but not preteens, and so on, right? So again, we will find something original and relevant in all sorts of stages. So, lastly, if we now think practically about what kind of literature should we look at. So, we have this topic of digital voice synthesizer. I'll stick with this example. The research question was, how do independent music bands negotiate issues of authenticity with their use of synthesizer software? What kind of literature should we be looking for? So this is a good example how we will have a number of strands of literature that we need to review. Because first, we need to look at digital voice synthesizers. Right? Has anybody written generally about software, digital sound software? Probably. Music studies did. Probably some technology studies did. Yeah. But probably not about musicians. Right? So then we need to reach from another literature that talks about independent music bands, perhaps in Japan, because that's what we did. And there's some cultural studies literature about that. Right? And then we need to bring them together, and we say, well, our contribution here is that we took this music studies, technology literature, and combined it with this social science, humanities literature about musicians to find out something new. Right? So our literature review draws from two completely different areas. Same here, the second example, the role of women editors in Europe, completely different topic. We are asking about the contribution of women editors to socio-cultural transformation in Europe in roughly 18th century. And we said last time that we might choose network analysis of corpus of periodical editorship from that time. Again, which literature we'll be drawing from. So again, if we put the role of women editors in Europe in 18th century into some sort of research database, library search, article search, Scopus and so on, there might not be many articles, right? And that's a good thing, because this is our topic. We don't want them to be too many things. So we step back and say, well, first, probably, we need to find literature about women editors of journals, of generally. Not in Europe, not in this time frame, perhaps, if there are not any. Generally, what are the theories, what are the studies about women editors? And if we find some, obviously, then we might want to look about some contextual literature. What happened in 18th century in Europe? What were the transformations? How do they relate to women in general? Right? Again, we will be drawing from slightly different areas, perhaps even disciplines. Our contribution will be, well, I will be comparing this literature. I'll be using this theory, applying it here. Right? So your literature review will not be just putting the keywords that pertain to your topic and looking for very specific studies from this area, but taking a step back and looking more generally about theories, about this whole area, and then looking at connections. Right. I'll finish here. Next time we'll see each other January 25th. It's a different room. Check your timetables. Until then, please think about your research question, about your abstract. The forms, as I said, everything is on Keats. If you have any questions, ask now or send me an email. I'll be here for another 5-10 minutes. Thank you.
Is it inconceivable to get a supervisor from CMCI, or does it have to be within code department?
I'll ask,
Yeah.
but I don't think it's likely.
Okay.
Yeah?
I'm just thinking, because my idea might straddle both in terms of dealing with film and its relationship to current digital techniques and propaganda, historical context of film in the 1930s, and how those have been sort of remediated into what's going on now in the digital space. You know, so it kind of would benefit from someone who's got some grounding in some of the sort of film space,
Media and
culture, possibly. But
there are a few people in the department.
yeah, well, I guess there might be.
I think generally, so the answer is no.
Okay.
Because of workloads and because of everything. If you want to send,
I'll send you an email and then you will just get I'm kind of thinking probably not, but it'd be good to know.
So if you send me an email, then I can follow up.
Okay, brilliant. Second very quick question. If in terms of the space I get into, if there genuinely isn't a ton of literature, you know, I mean, do you see dissertations that just don't have a very big review and stuff? Or is there a sort of sense that you've got to go and find something that
I think,
occupies the space of the literature?
I think, so this is where you will have more about theory rather than cases.
Yes.
Because this is where you will have the theory of the film generally and the theory of propaganda. And then say, I have my theory of propaganda, and these are the case studies. Maybe.
That would be. Okay, so you kind of answer that a bit, because there may not be much written on the specific issue.
But you still need to have your theories of your main concepts. So in a way, the length will not sort of, in a weird way, the length of the literature doesn't matter how much literature there is. So it's pretty rare to see a dissertation from somebody who genuinely doesn't have a sort of comprehensive literature review, because there's always something.
That needs to be looked at.
Because it's a mix of grand theories, specific case studies. Because you can always branch out, and I'm happy to talk about it in detail.
Okay, I think I need to know what to do. Cool. Great. Thank you.
If it's red, it is. You have something confidential then?
Not really.